Welcome to today's deep dive. If you are joining us to get a better handle on the forces that shape the global economy, well, you are in the right place.
You absolutely are.
Yeah, today we have a really fascinating stack of research to get through. It's centered on an NBER working paper by economists Şevket Pamuk and Jeffrey G. Williamson, and it's titled Ottoman De-industrialization, 1800 to 1913.
It is a phenomenal paper.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a major historical paradox that, challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom we hear today. Because usually when we think about a country hitting the global trade jackpot, we picture this golden era of prosperity.
Right. Like you find a global market, your exports boom, and foreign money just pours in.
Exactly. And suddenly the whole nation is supposedly getting richer.
I mean, it is the classic economic narrative we are all taught from a young age. You open your borders, you plug into the global market, and a rising tide lifts all boats. Trade brings wealth.
The ships leave full of your goods, they come back with cash, and you are building a modern, wealthy nation. But what happens when a massive, unprecedented boom in global trade actually does the exact opposite?
Yeah, what if being perfectly integrated into the global market actively dismantles and, well, destroys a major empire's entire manufacturing base?
That is the core paradox we're looking at today. We are exploring the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century.
And just for some context, this was a massive political and geographic entity. It covered present-day Turkey, the Balkans, and, much of the Middle East.
A huge area.
Massive. And during this period, despite an absolute explosion in their export wealth, they experienced this profound economic phenomenon known as de-industrialization.
Which completely flips the script on how we usually think about free trade.
Okay, let's unpack this. What does de-industrialization actually mean for the people living through it on the ground? Like, are we talking about huge factories shutting down, or is it something different? In the context of this specific paper, and, well, the 19th century economy in general, we can look at it through a relatively straightforward lens. De-industrialization here specifically means the movement of a nation's labor force out of manufacturing.
Okay.
And at that time, that wasn't modern assembly lines. It was primarily artisan work, like making textiles, spinning yarn, and weaving cloth. So it's moving out of that and moving into agriculture.
So you have a society where the workforce is just actively abandoning their workshops.
Exactly. Putting down their tools and heading out into the fields to farm.
Let me try to put this into perspective for you, the listener. Imagine your hometown is famous for making really great, high-quality shoes. Almost everyone in your community works in the local shoe workshop.
That's the lifeblood of the town.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But suddenly, a massive cargo ship arrives in the harbor. The merchants step off and they start selling foreign-made shoes for absolutely pennies on the dollar.
Yep.
I mean, you can't even buy the raw materials for the price they are selling the finished shoes.
It's impossible to compete with.
Exactly. But at the exact same time, these foreign buyers look at the fields around your town and say, hey, we will pay you an absolute fortune if you just sell us your raw cow leather and your local wheat.
That captures the dynamic beautifully. It is this intense, two-sided pressure.
Naturally, everyone in town looks at the math. They realize they can't compete with the cheap foreign shoes, but they can get rich selling raw leather. So they stop making shoes, they sell their cobbler tools, and they all start raising cows.
That makes perfect sense on an individual level.
Right. The town is technically still making money, perhaps even more than before, but the actual industry and the skill of shoemaking just vanishes from the community entirely.
And in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, this wasn't just a single ship arriving. It was an overwhelming wave. And it was driven by three massive interlocking historical forces that basically created the perfect storm for this kind of deindustrialization.
Which is wild because I don't imagine an entire empire abandons its workshops overnight. So what were the actual structural changes happening globally that forced this shift?
Well, the first force was simply the return of peace to Europe.
Oh, really? Just peace?
Yeah. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 finally brought peacetime conditions back to the Mediterranean. I mean, for decades, international trade had been completely choked off by naval blockades and conflicts.
Okay.
Suddenly, the waters were safe, and the gates for global commerce swung wide open.
That makes sense. Safe waters mean merchants are actually willing to put cargo on ships again without fear of it getting blown up?
Precisely. But the second force is what made those ships so dangerous to the local Ottoman artisans, and that's the British Industrial Revolution.
Right, the factories.
Exactly. While the Ottoman workforce, and really the rest of the world, was still relying on handlooms, manual labor, generational craftsmanship, Britain had spent the wartime years building these massive coal-fired textile factories.
They were just industrializing like crazy.
They had accumulated an enormous productivity advantage. They were churning out machine-made goods at a scale and a price that manual weavers simply couldn't comprehend. So peace meant Britain could finally unleash those cheap goods on the global market.
So you have safe oceans and this massive surplus of cheap British clothing. But moving thousands of tons of fabric from England to the Middle East still takes a lot of time and money, right?
It did, until the third force kicked in. And this might be the most dramatic catalyst of all. The ocean transport revolution.
Steamships.
Steamships. They changed the fundamental physics of global trade. Unlike sailing ships, which were relatively small and completely at the mercy of the wind, steamships could be built huge. And they ran on predictable, relentless schedules.
Which changes everything.
The paper notes that the introduction of steamships cut the freight costs of importing goods, like sending wheat from the Mediterranean all the way to London, or cotton textiles the other way, by nearly 80%.
Wait, 80%?
80%.
Wow. If you are listening to this, think about the shipping costs for whatever you buy online. Imagine that cost suddenly dropping by 80% permanently. The sheer volume of stuff moving around the world would just explode. Distance literally stopped being a barrier.
It really did.
And that brings us to the actual economic shockwave that hit the Ottomans. The paper refers to it as a terms of trade shock.
Yes. To understand the economics here, we have to look at a country's terms of trade. This is essentially the ratio between the prices a country gets paid for its exports versus the prices it has to pay for its imports.
And the numbers the authors provide are genuinely staggering. Between 1800 and 1860, the Ottoman terms of trade increased 2.6 times.
That's an unbelievable spike.
Yeah, that means the global market prices for the raw things the Ottomans exported, wheat, wool, raisins, figs, tobacco, and opium, those prices just shot up to record highs.
Right.
Meanwhile, because of British factories and those new steamships, the price of the manufactured goods the Ottomans were importing plummeted.
On paper, if you are looking at a national ledger, this looks like an enormous economic windfall. Your revenue from exports is multiplying, and your import costs are shrinking.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If I am an Ottoman farmer or a merchant in 1840, and suddenly London is paying me 2.6 times more for my raisins and my opium, and at the exact same time the imported British clothes I buy for my family are cheaper than ever, isn't that a massive win? My income is way up and my cost of living for basic goods is down. Why do economists consider this a problem?
What's fascinating here is that the benefit was highly uneven, and it created this hidden structural trap for the broader society. The authors of the paper highlight a phenomenon we commonly refer to today as the Dutch disease.
Dutch disease. Okay, walk me through how this trap actually springs on the average person.
Think about it from the perspective of an Ottoman landowner. Exporting those cash crops, the wheat, the silk, the opium, it became incredibly lucrative because of European demand.
Right.
So naturally, all the agricultural effort shifted toward exports. Landowners and farmers redirected their land, their water, their labor away from whatever they used to do and poured it all into growing things they could load onto a steamship bound for London.
Right, they chased the profit, they stopped growing food for the local village and started growing cash crops for the global market.
And that is where the trap snaps shut on the urban working class.
Oh, man.
Because the Ottoman artisans, the weavers, the everyday laborers, they didn't survive on expensive exported goods like opium or prime export wheat. They ate local non-traded foods, things like barley, rye, lentils, and beans.
Basic staples.
Exactly. But because all the agricultural resources had aggressively shifted to export crops, there was suddenly a massive shortage of these basic everyday foodstuffs.
Oh, I see. The local farmers aren't growing lentils anymore because they're busy growing tobacco for the British. So the supply of a basic bowl of lentils just plummets.
Which means the price of that bowl of lentils goes through the roof. The paper notes that the consumer price index in the Ottoman Empire, which was heavily dominated by basic food, essentially doubled between 1800 and 1860.
Oh.
Food became incredibly expensive for the common person.
Yeah.
And because basic survival got so expensive, workers in the cities and the remaining textile workshops needed significantly higher wages just to buy a loaf of barley bread.
I get it now. If I own a textile workshop in Istanbul, I'm getting squeezed to death from both directions.
Precisely.
On one side, I am trying to compete with ultra-cheap British shirts flooding off those steamships. But on the other side, my own workers are demanding double the wages just so they don't starve.
Yeah.
I can't possibly lower my prices to compete with the British because my labor costs are skyrocketing due to the food shortage.
You are touching on the exact mechanism that hollowed out their economy. Those rising nominal wages completely destroyed whatever competitiveness Ottoman textile manufacturers had left. The cost of making a piece of cloth locally became impossibly high compared to just buying the British import.
It's like the agricultural export boom actively cannibalized the manufacturing base.
It really is.
And the human cost of this is laid bare in the paper's statistics. Let's look at the city of Aleppo in modern-day Syria. In the 18th century, the authors estimate Aleppo had around 40,000 handlooms operating. It was a thriving manufacturing hub.
A true cornerstone of regional industry.
But by the 1820s, after the war's end and the British goods start flowing, that number falls to 25,000. And by 1850, down to just over 5,000.
Unbelievable.
We are talking about nearly a 90% drop in a matter of decades. Across the whole empire, Ottoman domestic producers went from supplying 97% of their own home market in the 1820s to supplying just 25 to 35% by the 1870s.
We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people losing their livelihoods, their generational skills evaporating, and entire communities being forced out of skilled labor and into basic agriculture just to survive.
Which brings us to the role of the government. Because when you see an entire domestic industry collapsing that rapidly, you expect the leadership to step in.
Right.
You expect tariffs, protectionism, closing the ports, literally something to stop the bleeding. But the Ottomans did the exact opposite.
They did, and it is a crucial piece of this puzzle.
Yeah.
In 1838, the Ottoman government signed the Anglo-Turkish Commercial Convention. It was a very aggressive free trade treaty.
Okay.
It abolished all the local monopolies that had previously offered a thin layer of protection to local industries. But more importantly, it locked Ottoman import duties, the taxes on incoming British goods, at a tiny 3 to 5%. Meanwhile, they actually set export duties at 12%.
Wait, let me stop you there because this makes absolutely no sense economically.
Yeah.
They taxed their own exports at 12%, but gave British imports essentially a free pass at 3 to 5%.
That was the reality of the treaty. Across the mid-19th century, average tariffs in the Ottoman Empire hovered around 7.5%. To put that in perspective, during this exact same period, places like the United States and Latin America were fiercely protectionist.
Right.
They were building their own industries behind massive tariff walls that averaged around 30%.
I really have to push back here. Did the Ottoman leadership just not understand economics? Why on earth would they sign a treaty that actively destroyed their own factories and workshops while the US and Latin America were smartly protecting theirs? Were they tricked by the British? Or was there intense lobbying from the Ottoman farmers who wanted to export more?
The paper actually investigates that, and surprisingly, it wasn't agricultural lobbying. The rural elite in the Ottoman Empire were not organized enough to force a national treaty like this. The real reason the Ottomans threw their economic doors wide open was pure geopolitical survival.
Geopolitical survival? What was threatening them so badly that they'd sacrifice their entire economy?
In the 1830s, the Ottoman Empire was facing massive, existential military threats.
Like who?
Well, to the north, the Russian Empire was constantly expanding and pressuring their borders. But even more terrifying, they were facing a massive internal rebellion. Muhammad Ali, the Ottoman governor of Egypt, had essentially gone rogue.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he built a modernized army, marched out of Egypt, conquered Syria, and was literally threatening to march on the capital in Istanbul.
Oh, wow.
Sultan's forces were being crushed. The Ottoman government desperately needed the military and political intervention of the British Empire to stop the Egyptians and deter the Russians.
Wow. So this wasn't an economic decision at all.
Not at all.
It was a ransom. They traded their domestic manufacturing sector for a military alliance. They signed a free trade treaty that enriched Britain to ensure British gunboats would help keep the Sultan on the throne.
It was a desperate calculation. They sacrificed their local weavers and spinners on the altar of imperial survival. And the tragedy is, once they signed those treaties to get short-term military help, they locked themselves into low tariffs permanently.
They couldn't go back.
Exactly. They gave up the exact policy tools they would have needed to protect and rebuild their industries later on.
That is such a fascinating and tragic dynamic. a trap built out of geography, global economics, and military desperation. But as I read deeper into the paper, it points out that this isn't a simple story of total defeat. It wasn't just a straight line to zero for Ottoman manufacturing.
History rarely is. The economic forces were brutal, but certain industries actually survived. And in some regions, they found very clever ways to push back against the British dominance.
And the primary key to that survival seems to be geography. Because if the government wouldn't build a tariff wall, the landscape of the empire essentially built one for them.
Exactly. Think about the physical terrain of the Ottoman Empire. We aren't just talking about accessible coastal cities like Istanbul, Izmir, or Beirut, where the steamships could easily dock. We are talking about the vast, rugged, mountainous interior of Anatolia and the Balkans.
Right, tough terrain.
During the first half of the 19th century, before trains existed, moving heavy, bulky goods over that kind of land was incredibly slow and expensive.
Right. If a British ship drops off 10,000 cheap shirts at a port city, getting them 100 miles inland means loading them onto the backs of a camel caravan.
Yes,
And the sheer time and cost of feeding those camels and paying the merchants essentially erases the British price advantage by the time the shirts reach a mountain village.
exactly. The rugged interior geography acted as a natural physical tariff.
Yeah.
Local artisans in remote regions survived decades longer simply because the cheap European goods couldn't affordably reach them.
But it wasn't just artisans hiding in the mountains either. Some of the urban weavers who were right there on the coast got incredibly clever. I was wondering, did they try to compete by making highly specialized luxury goods? Like, how did they stay afloat?
They did something much more practical. They essentially weaponized the British Industrial Revolution against the British.
By using the imported materials.
Yes, the British factories were churning out machine-spun cotton yarn at prices so low it was basically impossible to beat.
Right.
The Ottoman weavers looked at this and realized they couldn't compete in spinning raw yarn anymore. It was a lost cause. So they stopped trying. Instead, they bought the ultra-cheap British yarn and used it as the input material for their own traditional handlooms.
That is brilliant. They lowered their own overhead costs by using the cheap foreign material, but kept the actual value add, the weaving, in their own hands.
And because these weavers lived in the empire, they intimately understood local Ottoman consumer tastes. They knew the specific patterns, the durability requirements, the specific blends of cotton and silk that people in different regions wanted for their traditional garments.
Stuff the British factories couldn't do.
Exactly. The massive British factories were built for standardized, uniform production. They couldn't perfectly imitate those nuanced local styles. So the Ottoman weavers adapted, using cheap foreign yarn to weave custom fabrics that the locals actually preferred.
That kind of resilience is incredible. And the paper notes it actually led to a period of stabilization. By the 1860s, the de-industrialization on the coast slowed down.
Yeah, the worst of it passed.
Right, the initial shock of the steamships wore off, the export prices stopped skyrocketing so aggressively, and the surviving Ottoman artisans found this tense new equilibrium.
What?
Here's where it gets really interesting. The railroads. Just as steamships conquered the oceans in the first 50 years, railroads conquered the land in the next 50. And I'm guessing that completely erased the geographical protection of the interior we were just talking about.
It annihilated it.
Mm.
Suddenly, you have iron tracks cutting straight through the mountains into the Anatolian heartland and the Syrian interior. A journey that used to take weeks by camel now takes hours by train.
So those cheap imported British textiles that were stuck in the port cities are now flooding the interior markets. But it works both ways, doesn't it? The railroads aren't just bringing shirts in, they are taking things out.
You're exactly right. The railroads acted like giant vacuums. They sucked the interior wheat, barley, and agricultural goods out of the mountains, rushed them to the ports, and sold them on the global market.
Which means the local food supply in the interior suddenly vanishes, and the prices inland equalize with the massive prices in London.
Yep. The Dutch disease finally reached the mountains. The inland artisans, who had been protected for half a century, were suddenly hit by the exact same devastating wave of high food prices, wage inflation, and cheap foreign competition that had wiped out the coastal cities decades earlier.
Just a total disaster.
It triggered a massive second wave of deindustrialization. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the paper does an excellent job of showing how extreme the Ottoman experience was compared to the rest of the world. The authors compare the Ottoman Empire to other parts of the poor periphery during the 19th century, places like India, Latin America, and Southeast Asia.
How did the Ottomans stack up against those regions? Like, did everyone suffer this badly?
Not to this extent. India, for example, experienced deindustrialization under British rule, but their terms of trade shock, that massive boom in their export prices, was actually relatively modest compared to the Middle East. Latin America, on the other hand, had a massive boom in export prices, very similar to the Ottomans.
But Latin America didn't lose all its manufacturing because, as we mentioned earlier, they had those 30% tariff walls.
Exactly. They protected their domestic markets. The data shows that Egypt and the Ottoman Empire experienced the absolute largest terms of trade booms in the entire developing world, combined with incredibly low, politically forced tariffs.
A lethal combination.
Consequently, they suffered some of the most dramatic, rapid, and severe deindustrialization of any region on Earth.
So what does this all mean? We have taken you on a journey through 19th century textile mills, British steamships, the geopolitics of the Russian army, and the price of a bowl of lentils.
And a lot.
It is a dense piece of history, but the core takeaway here is vital. The story of the Ottoman Empire proves that simply being plugged into the global economy is not a guaranteed path to balanced long-term prosperity.
It forces us to critically question the simplistic narrative of free trade. A massive boom in one sector of your economy, like exporting raw commodities, can inadvertently starve and destroy your manufacturing sector.
Right.
By altering local wages, by making food too expensive for factory workers, the success of the farms can literally bankrupt the workshops.
And as you think about this, I want you to remember that this isn't just dusty history from 200 years ago.
Not at all. If you look at the news today, you see constant debates about global supply chains. You hear arguments about the impact of tariffs, about whether a country should actively protect its local manufacturing base or just embrace cheap foreign imports.
It's everywhere.
When you see those debates, you are watching the exact same economic forces that reshaped the Ottoman Empire. The technology has changed from steamships and hand looms to container ships and semiconductor fabs, but the underlying mechanics of global trade, wage inflation, and industrial survival remain identical.
It is the shoemaking town analogy playing out on a global scale over and over again, which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. If completely opening your borders to free trade and experiencing a massive boom in your raw exports can technically boost a nation's GDP in the short run, while simultaneously wiping out the generational skills, the specialized tools, and the factories of its working class, how should we actually measure the true wealth of a nation today? Is wealth just defined by the total amount of money flowing into the country on a spreadsheet, or is it defined by what a country actually knows how to make?